Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting for everyone to get access into the webinar, and then we shall begin. We're getting there. Okay, we shall just start, I think. A warm welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us here today for what I hope will be actually the start of many future meetings looking at how we can collectively decarbonise the wholesale industry. Before we start, the webinar is being recorded so that you can share it with your colleagues, and we will also be sending out to those members that unfortunately weren't able to join us here today. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panelists that will be presenting. Scottish Power will be presenting first, and there will be a couple of questions after their session. We'll then go into Ulemco, our Hydrogen Accelerator, and Arcola, and have a Q&A session at the end of their presentations. If we don't manage to answer all your questions, we will follow them up after the webinar. Certainly, today is the first tangible output since we started our decarbonisation of the wholesale industry project, and that was launched back in January. The project's designed to look at how and where our members and sector can reduce their emissions from our fleets to our buildings, and even how our people move around. The overall aim of which is to create a greener, more sustainable food and drink supply chain. This afternoon, you'll be hearing from myself, just giving you a brief overview and outline of the initial findings of phase 1 of our project, the actual report of which should come out hopefully within the next 2 weeks. We're just making some amendments to it. I'll be followed by Barry Crothers, Hydrogen Director at Scottish Power, and he will be talking you through the hydrogen production here in Scotland and what they would like to know from you, our members. Amanda Lyne will follow Barry. She's an MD at Ulemco, and where she'll be presenting current hybrid and dual fuel solutions in the transition to full hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Following Amanda, we have Fiona Landy, Delivery Manager at apologies, skipping on one too many. Delivery Manager at Hydrogen Accelerator, and Ben Todd, Chief Exec at Arcola Energy. They'll be presenting the future development of hydrogen fuel cell powered heavy goods vehicles, and give more detail on SWA's exciting partnership with them and looking at the feasibility study to hopefully get a 44-tonne hydrogen fuel cell truck on the roads of Scotland. So I guess let's just get started. Back in March, we started to undertake a survey with you, the members, looking at your fleets, the type of vehicles in use, their fuel use, where they operate, etc. And this was to allow us to start and measure our sector's emissions and calculate our carbon footprint. Well, it also allowed us to start and build relationships with the companies such as those that are here joining us today. And it would also help us draw up a wholesale fleet decarbonisation roadmap to net zero. Why do this? Frankly, it is there to support you and our sector. That's what the association is here to do, is to start and make you think about your options and hopefully provide solutions for you in the transition to becoming a carbon neutral company. Change is going to be costly, it's going to require time, a lot of analysis, and a lot of future planning, all of which, under the current situation caused by COVID and Brexit, nobody has time to do. So if the SWA can do this for you at a sector level, we can pool resource, create efficiencies, and work with government to help them deliver their policies and objectives, but also at the same time hopefully persuading them to unlock support for our sector and your transition to net zero. So here's the start of the data that we've got from yourselves and the sector. As you can see, the wholesale industry in Scotland has a total of 2,198 vehicles. The largest number of those being our HGVs at 1,055, and that represent 48% of those total numbers. So HGVs represent nearly half of the total number of our fleet of vehicles. Of those HGVs, 91% are rigids, with over half of them being 17-ton and above. And that's important when we're coming to talk about the projects with Arcola. The remaining 9% of the HGVs are being the larger articulated trucks, and again, we will come back to shortly. 25% of our fleet are made up of cars, 16% vans or light goods vehicles. And what is interesting, obviously, is 88%, interesting but not surprising, 88% of all vehicles are powered by fossil fuels. And this is clearly a problem that needs addressing in order for Scottish Government to attain net zero targets by 2045. If we now actually look at our carbon footprint, our sector emits the equivalent of nearly 111,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. For the techies, the figure is a combination of Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions. For those that haven't bothered how it's calculated, there will be more explanation in the report when it comes out anyway. I think this graph sort of highlights better the highest vehicle pollutants. 75% of all our emissions come from our HGVs, with the rigids alone making up 56% of all emissions. And that can be seen in the first four graphs, or the first four bars to the left-hand side, where 3 of them are the rigids. Interesting that they make up 56%, but actually they only represent 36% of the total number in our fleet. Meanwhile, a further 11% of our carbon footprint is from our articulated vehicles, and which represented 9% of our HGVs, but actually only represented 4.5% of the total number in our fleet. Therefore, evidence suggests that they are the largest polluter by individual vehicle. It's also interesting that only 7% of our emissions come from cars, despite them representing 25% of the total number of fleet. However, unlike cars, where 5% of our sector is already electric, there's currently no electric solutions for those larger vehicles. So it's clear that the biggest opportunity in decarbonising our industry is also our biggest challenge. And how do we decarbonise those large vehicles? When it comes to looking at a roadmap, and please, this is provisional, this is not for sharing because we've not finalised this yet. When it looks at the roadmap to net zero, it is difficult to quantify because it is very much dependent on the development of new technology that we're here to talk about today and the required infrastructure needed to support this. Within our report, we have analysed and made recommendations on the different ways in which members can start to reduce their fleet emissions as of today and going forward as technology develops. These include increasing operational efficiencies, such as driver training and fuel management, through to looking at the pros and cons of potentially using transitional options such as HVO, LNG, or liquid gas, biogas, and dual fuel. Making change today and moving to electric vehicles in our cars and smaller vehicles by 2030 could help the sector achieve a 15 to 20% reduction in emissions by that time. However, as HGV replacement and development timelines stand today, it's probably not likely that we'll achieve much more than a 36% reduction by 2035, and only thereafter hydrogen and electric fuel cells will have become much more commercially available and feasible for operators. But it's not just looking about the technology development, it's also about looking at the barriers preventing people or businesses from the take-up, encouraging them and incentivizing them to adapt to those new technologies. So we did survey what the barriers were. Of no surprise, cost and lack of financial support to incentivize change were cited as top barriers. It's no surprise, especially when our sector is working on 1.3% net margins, and that's something that we will always be telling governments and their agencies when we're speaking to them. So this report that we've produced, along with the support of the people here today, will try and unlock those sort of financial incentives through Scottish Government and UK Government There is huge investment currently going into hydrogen development, and we believe that incentives or subsidies are not provided to those early adopters, then change will not take place, and certainly not at the scale required to reach Scottish Government net zero targets by 2045. So on that note, I'm actually going to pass now over to Barry Crullers, and where we'll start and see where change is happening and how you can get involved.
Thank you very much, Colin. It'll probably take me 16 minutes to get my slides to share, to be honest, but I'll give you a very quick rundown of what we're going to cover, because it will be quick from our side, because I suspect actually this is the boring bit, and that we hope to take care of all these issues behind the scenes. So if you want to switch off the next 10 minutes, this is the bit you want to miss, because actually Ben and Fiona and Amanda are going to do interesting bits later. But it is important that we explain to you our role in this. And just to be clear, we are at Scottish Power, we are all about decarbonisation solutions. We're not just in the game of just selling hydrogen for the sake of hydrogen. So you will see us working across electrification and certainly hydrogen for us. So me as a hydrogen director, I just absolutely love this portion of it and this sector, because of working with people like Amanda and Ben and Fiona. Actually, it's opened up new ways of decarbonising, which actually 2, 3, certainly 5 years ago looked really, really tricky. So I'll be really quick in our area. I'm sure a lot of you already know Scottish Power. You're probably fed up getting bills from us on a monthly basis, and 1.3% margin, that sounds pretty good. Actually, that would be attractive to us. But so that's the bit of the business that everybody thinks of, because you don't like getting your bill. But really the other parts of the business, just to give you a picture here, we have the renewables business, and that's where a lot of this comes from. So the renewable electrons is where this is going to start. The more we build onshore, offshore wind and solar farms, that's going to give us the electrons. We're going to use it with electrolyzers, and that's how we're going to get green hydrogen. So actually, appreciating that Scottish Power is building new renewable energy assets is going to unlock electrification of transport, but it's also going to unlock the hydrogen parts of the sector as well. And of course, there's areas of the country, as you see here, shaded in green, where we actually operate the network as well. Now, you'll hear us talk a lot about, obviously, Scottish Power, UK and Ireland, and certainly a Scottish focus. But for anyone that's kind of thinking about international aspects, whenever you think Scottish Power, for us, Iberdrola is interchangeable with Scottish Power as a name, because even though we have lots of friends and colleagues based in Madrid, we're actually operating in all these different countries across the world, and actually a lot of them not on the map as well. So it does open up things like port infrastructure. How do we get goods across the water, across ferries? That's something that we're doing in a joined up fashion as well. Now, we made a strategic choice to really get into this last year, because hopefully it does make a lot of logical sense, actually, that if you're producing renewable electrons, we think that that will only get you 80 to 90% of decarbonisation. That extra 10, 20% of the economy really does need hydrogen to help. It needs a molecule rather than an electron. So that's why we know we have the right basis to build upon. And a few kind of example projects to flag up to you very quickly, but only to highlight this one in particular, south of Glasgow, because it's the first major one that we've put into planning, and therefore it's accelerated beyond other ones. So if you know the Whiteley wind farm, just south of Glasgow, it's 539 megawatts of wind power. So it's UK's largest and arguably Europe's largest. There's always a wind farm in Romania that claims to be bigger, but I don't think anyone's gone round and counted the number of turbines. So we'll still claim that. But the point is, that's existing wind energy. We're looking to build new solar, and we're looking to put up to 20 megawatts of hydrogen production there. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to drive up to a wind farm to refuel. The model that we're kind of looking for here is to get the cost of production of hydrogen down as much as we can, and therefore that allows us to do refueling in other areas. So that's one to keep an eye on, and you might see that in the news. Other things that we're doing across the group, and the same engineering team, I should say, and we share all knowledge internally across Scottish Power, Iberdrola. We're doing bus refueling projects, for example, in Barcelona as well. So all these things are starting to really move at a pace across the different countries. Now, I kind of talked earlier about the kind of 80, 90% electrification, and our CEOs famously in the past said electrify the hell out of everything. Now that is true, and we stick by that. But for all the things that we know, and I've just said, at certain times you need a molecule. Now, it feels like certainly the heavier end of road transport is where that plays out. Of course, trains, shipping, aviation, but also just industry, manufacturing, all the heavier end. Now, it's important that those things also exist, because the more we build out at scale for all these different companies and all these different customers, reduces everybody's costs. So it's a good thing that hydrogen has more uses, because then we get greater economies of scale. As I say, the unit price can come down. So at this point, Andy, I don't know, I should say I've got a colleague on the call, Andy Goodwin, who's our head of economics and markets. I'm going to pass to him in a wee minute about the really complicated stuff. I know that you guys already know all this, and I know that Ben and Amanda's going to cover it, so we'll not dwell on any of this. But Andy, do you want to cover any of this section here about total cost of ownership models?
Yeah, I can do briefly, Barry. I mean, the idea of the next couple of slides is really just to show that there's a kind of consensus view that the cost of using battery electric vehicles or fuel cell could be roughly the same, and that's what's shown in this study, both at 2020 and in 2050. And on the next slide, Barry has got another similar study, which was a European study. And don't worry about the numbers, looking at the numbers too much, but the idea is just to show that it's an equivalent overall cost of battery electric and hydrogen. So the idea then is again on the next slide, Barry, I mean, people can look at those in your own time, but the idea is that if the cost, the efficiency and the costs are similar, there are then benefits of using hydrogen, which kind of real practical benefits of using hydrogen, which kind of push it ahead of battery electric only in many ways. And so these are, so I think a lot of these relate to how similar it is to the model that many people have with diesel trucks at the moment. So the range is similar, it's similar refueling times. And again, compared to battery electric, the vehicles are lighter. and the actual site themselves, again, similar operational. You don't need as much room for the kind of refueling infrastructure or the charging infrastructure as you would do with battery electric. Yeah, so and again, this is a view of how Element Energy see it going into the future in one particular scenario. So it's relatively balanced. You get battery electric and hydrogen, but in this case, particularly for hydrogen from fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell at depots, it provides about 50% of the solution, if you like. So yeah, so the economics. And then before we get into the economics, so these are our different options for how you configure hydrogen and how it relates to the customer. So on option one, this is where you have the electrolyzer, the hydrogen production facility or the electrolyzer on the same site as the customer or the hydrogen refueling station, and you then bring the electricity in through the electricity grid from the renewable asset. So this is all 100% renewable electricity driving the hydrogen production, but that's off-site. Option two is where you have the electrolyzer on the same site, so co-located with the renewable electricity, and then you transport it. Could be by tube trailer, could be by pipeline to the customer or to the refueling point. The third option is where all three are together, so you have the renewables, the customer, and the electrolyzer all on one site. So in that case, you're cutting out all your transport costs and all your electricity distribution costs. So yeah, so in terms of the costs, so we're seeing on the right hand side, a Bloomberg study is showing it could be €3 to €7 per kilo at the moment, and there's the potential for that to go down to between 2 and 3 euros per kilo by 2030. And the things that are really driving that down are the renewable costs come down. So in the last 10 years, the cost of offshore wind, for example, have come down by more than half, and that will continue to happen in the next 10 years and beyond. So that cost reduction will reduce the price of hydrogen. The electrolyzer capex, as you get more being deployed, the cost of that will come down, and you'll have technology innovations. The efficiency of the electrolyzers will also improve, so that will reduce the costs. And we see that the cost of green hydrogen will come down probably to around €2 a kilo by around 2030 because of that volume of hydrogen production deployment that we're doing. So in government support mechanisms, this is a very complicated, well, it's a very busy slide. I'm not expecting you to read all of it, but it's really just to give you an idea of the complexity of the support mechanism space, if you like. So this is including all funding mechanisms from UK government and from Scottish government, and there is still one remaining that's still relevant from the EU. And so some of these are sector specific, some are on the supply side, so hydrogen supply side, some are on the demand side, trying to encourage people to switch to hydrogen options. Some kind of do a bit of both. And so if we move on from that to these I think are the key ones for the transport sector. So the biggest one I think is the renewable transport fuel obligation, which was started about 12-13 years ago, but was extended in 2018 to include hydrogen as an eligible renewable fuel. Out of the others, so the Scottish government, the UK government, Net Zero Hydrogen Fund and the hydrogen business models, all of those three rows at the bottom are aimed at supporting hydrogen production. So just to take the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, for example, that's a commitment of 240 million to 2025. The UK government is consulting on that at the moment, and that's really to provide a upfront capex payment to make it hydrogen production cheaper. And that's one that we're particularly focused on at the moment. But just to move on again, Barry, so the renewable transport fuel obligation, as I said, I think this is a really significant potential driver of moving to hydrogen. So very briefly, the RTFO is an obligation on fuel suppliers to supply a certain proportion of their fuel from renewable sources. So largely in the past, this has been around biofuels, but as I said, hydrogen in 2018 was added as an eligible fuel. And it actually gets double the reward to other forms of biofuel, and that for various reasons. When you're converting from a quantity to a kilogram of hydrogen, it means it gets 9 certificates, 9 RTFCs, renewable transport fuel certificates, for every kilogram that you produce, and that could give a value of around between £5 and £6 per kilo, which will bring down the cost of hydrogen to potentially around 3, which is at a level where we think it becomes competitive. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Barry. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, Andy. And I guess, on that slide, actually, that previous slide, we've said nominally 60 pence against RTFCs. Now, that's a variable, obviously, that could be much higher, could be 75, could be 80 pence, depends how you trade them over time. But to get the order of magnitude, it is worth about £5 to £6 per kilogram, and therefore it is really, really substantial to unlock some of these earlier projects. And just to explain a wee bit what we mean about the kind of hub and spoke model that we've talked about, this is why I guess I said at the start this should be boring for you guys, because this is our job. Our job is to find out whether we should be making large volumes of hydrogen near a wind farm, near solar panels, at the top of a hill somewhere, and then using hydrogen driven hydrogen tractor tube trailers to deliver it to refueling sites. Really hard to see the large scale hydrogen production in an urban environment to refuel buses at a bus depot, for example. So we're going to have to try and make all these economics work for all of us. But what we're trying to do is use that, at least that concept of hub and spoke, to look at key strategic locations across UK and Ireland, actually, even though we didn't stick it on this map, both Northern and Republic of Ireland, so that we have things like port coverage, urban environments, major trunk roads, everything that basically gives you, these are not the places that we would have refueling stations. They would be much smaller dots and everywhere, but these would be big kind of strategic centres of production, and that kind of brings the cost down, as Andy was explaining. So really, I mean, for us, it's just that it's an open offer to work with all of you, as we're already working with Amanda and Ben and Fiona, for example. No, I don't think any single player and any single stakeholder group can make this happen. It's going to have to be the whole ecosystem and probably all the people on the call today working together to where is it needed, when is it needed, how much do you need, and try and bring a whole package together. And that's our kind of open invitation, is to work collaboratively in that way.
Thanks very much, Barry. Some people might be confused from the start of the first few slides, as I was slightly as you were rushing through. But I guess all our members need to really know is what you want from them. What is it you need to know to enable the cost to come down? Because that is a big issue. You know, we need the cost of hydrogen to come down, as you've already explained, because you know, diesel fuel is one of the most expensive elements of our operations. So the quicker that can come down, the better. So yeah, one question, I know that John's got a question there. One question I was going to ask, actually, because I know you're focusing at Whiteley, certainly it's all about green hydrogen production. UK government came out with their hydrogen strategy, and they were backing both horses, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. What does that do for you know, Whiteley and the producers such as yourself developing the hydrogen, you know, where you really are focusing on green, but now you know potentially UK government certainly are backing blue as well?
I mean, great question. It's fairly logical, I think, where this has come from. As you can imagine, you know, even when you think back to the days of power sector and the evolution that's gone on, to see renewable technologies come to the fore and be incentivized, and now we would expect our electricity supply to be as clean as possible, as close to 100% renewable as possible, and that's the transition that we're on as a country. So we shut down coal, we shut down gas, you reduce your reliance on fossil fuels, and you move to renewable technology. Now for us, in the hydrogen space, we're just going straight to that. We don't want to prolong any kind of reliance on fossil fuel-based hydrogen, which essentially blue hydrogen is. Now, it's still certainly much cleaner than grey hydrogen, and I know this is thrown out random colours there that might not make a lot of sense to people, but certainly blue hydrogen is going to be much cleaner than grey hydrogen, but it's also going to still emit millions of tonnes of CO2. So for us, that transition that we've gone on as a company to move to 100% renewable and clean electrons, that's going to unlock 100% green and therefore clean hydrogen. So for us, it's just a principal point. It's a philosophical point that we believe that zero means zero. And it's a wee bit like having an electric car, plugging it in to charge it, but then not having a renewable energy tariff in the background. That's a wee bit counterintuitive. So the same thing would apply here. We kind of think that getting zero emission fuel into zero emission vehicles makes it zero emission by definition.
Okay, good. John is asking, given the current situation worldwide in terms of climate change, do we anticipate, or do you anticipate that the dates given may be accelerated or moved forward? I presume that is meaning in terms of the net zero ambition, Scotland 2045 and 2050 by UK government.
Yeah, you would like to think so. I mean, everything from, well, certainly domestic government targets being challenging in their own right, and moves that we can make within our own borders. But things like COP26, you know, it's all over the news, and to be honest, it can seem quite, I guess, peripheral to some folk, and they might not quite get the impact and importance of it. But things like COP26 is where those really high-level commitments will come down into legislative changes. They'll come into bans, incentives, funding mechanisms, and it will genuinely start to change our daily lives. It will stop us buying certain vehicles. It will encourage us to do other things in food and drink, as we know, in agriculture, the way we travel, the way we heat our homes. All of that, I'm sure you guys probably all feel the same. It feels like that's been accelerated, doesn't it, by all the kind of recent events we've seen. It's certainly up the agenda, and therefore it feels quite hard to see big businesses make decisions which are not completely aligned with the decarbonisation kind of challenge and journey. That's certainly my personal experience, but probably our company experience as well.
I think the challenges we've presented I presented just a minute ago in terms of our own decarbonisation timeline, certainly for our fleets, it's going to be an eye-on impossibility to get them decarbonised by 2045, because it's dependent on everyone here today and you putting the infrastructure in place, and then the developers getting the technology out on the road, literally. Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't understand. I can't see how they can move the goalposts of the timelines if the technology is not there to match it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's why our last slide had the old chicken and egg thing, because it is very much a duplication of the conversation that's happened with electric cars. You know, how can you buy an electric car if the charge points are not there? And that is exactly why hopefully we have sessions like this, where we do line up infrastructure from our side to be rolled out at the exact same time that you have people thinking about transitioning their fleets. That's exactly it. It all has to move together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well, there's plenty of time to ask more questions, but what we will do now is go on to our next speaker, and Amanda from ULEMCO. Amanda, are you ready? Perfect.
Hi, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it. If you, it's not in presenter view.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and you can hear me as well.
Indeed. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, actually, I think my first couple of slides build quite nicely into the question that we received and what we should be doing to accelerate the transition, actually, because I want to just remind everybody that where the net zero target comes through in some date, 30 years, that's actually either a long time or a short time, depending on what your attention span is to the problem. But the fact is, actually, we are damaging the climate today. We are putting more CO2 into the atmosphere than we really want to do. And the climate target is set as allowing 1.5 degrees of global warming. That's not saying it's going back to something that we used to have. It's saying we're going to allow it to get up, in theory, scientifically, to 1.5 degrees will enable us to kind of mitigate against the worst effects of climate change. But the fact is, we're already experiencing climate change issues now. And 1.5 degrees already assumes if we hit that net zero target by 2050 in less than 30 years time, that we will lose most of the glaciers in Canada, large proportion of the coral reef in Australia, and large proportions of landmass will be flooded. And there'll also be people dying from heat exhaustion at record temperatures in the South Mediterranean that we've never seen before and we don't hope to see again. That's actually what 1.5 degrees and the budget we're doing. So frankly, everything that we could be doing now to save CO2 within that budget is something that we should be trying to do. So whether the target is 2045, 2035 or 2050, frankly, we shouldn't care. We should be trying to reduce CO2 emissions now. Bringing that into scope for transport, the graph that you can see behind you there clearly shows how well Barry's core business, the electricity generation business, has done to bring down our emissions to zero emission. And we all know in Scotland, actually, that we've had lots of occasions where our electricity has all been renewable, 100% renewable, matching the demand, but actually we need to export some of that to elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is we've done really well with the power sector. What we haven't done well yet at all, despite the fact that we've had the targets known for the length of time we've known it, is done anything, frankly, to mitigate the carbon emissions from our transport energy piece. And actually, I just want to remind that that's the energy we're using, not the numbers of vehicles. So that's quite important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we have done nothing. And that does even include when we start to look at the sort of mix of what we've done with few percentages of passenger cars that we now see, and it's coming more common. But the realization of how radical this change needs to be under focus, that we have less than 30 years to try and mitigate what we're doing in terms of climate change impact. So I'm going to bring that down into something that's this chart is not meant to be controversial, but it's one scenario, a slightly different scenario than the one that Barry and colleagues presented about what might happen with the HGV fleet over the next 30 years, starting with the fact that there are 500,000 vehicles in the car park today, let alone the extra thousands of buses and other vehicles that we would also need to decarbonise. And to date, so very, very few of them are alternatively fueled. There's a few natural gas vehicles possibly done under certified biogas, but that frankly, most of the HGV fleet that we have is diesel, and your own figures, Colin, showed that from your members. In less than 10 years, we will meet a carbon budget that's a proportion of this 1.5 allocation that we're allowed to admit. Not quite, don't really like the words of that. And the government, the UK, the national government is talking about if we start to ban the sale of non-zero emission vehicles, and I'll come back to zero emission in a minute, by 2035, allowing for the fact that we have vehicles that are on the road in some at least 3 to 5 years. Certainly in the first owner, they're going to be in the road for another 7 years onto the second owner, and taking into account the fleet transitions, that we need to somehow have some date that says we're not going to go with anything other than zero emission. Now, one of the things that's really important for us to think about is actually the target is not zero emissions. What we should be thinking about is carbon reduction. So this chart is based on some numbers that have been suggested by the APC, looking at what the technology is available. And it is true that if we looked at other renewable fuels, alternative fuels, we could make some inroad in the first 10 years or so of this process into the carbon emissions of diesel by replacing them with alternative fuels. But the alternative fuels are not applicable for everything. The electric vehicles, few thousand of them on the road would make no inroad into a 500,000 car park field. But by 2050, we think, and the APC thinks, a third of the vehicles could be electric, so that's fine, and 2/3 of them will be hydrogen. I don't want to get into the debate of whether that's hydrogen combustion or fuel cell or whatever. The fact is they need to be zero emission and they will be using hydrogen. So we need a lot of hydrogen into the transport sector. And what we need to do is provide demand for Barry to get on and make his investment, because if you take the target that we're talking about at the moment, and the slide in front of you is actually the UK figure, but frankly, I would say Scotland has set a target to have 5 gigawatts of green hydrogen available by 2030. If you do modelling on how much hydrogen that actually means, it's in the order of about 400,000 tonnes. It could be a bit more, a bit less, depending on when they choose, what the productivity, the efficiency is. And in any reckoning by 2030, if all of that green hydrogen, and remembering that this is in a low hanging fruit area, in an area that we know we can't decarbonise, would be between 15 to 20,000 vehicles. So actually, if we deliver on the targets that we're trying to do and what Barry is trying to do, we could use all of that green hydrogen into transport, 15 to 20,000 vehicles. We could add some buses into that, but that's what the opportunity for the kind of investment and stake that Barry and Scottish Power are making says we could put into vehicles, 15 to 20,000. And I think, Colin, you said you have about, your members have about 2,000 vehicles, something like that. So, you know, in Scotland, we should have an ambition, shouldn't we, that all of that gigawatt goes to help us in decarbonising. And that would accelerate your roadmap, Colin. It would accelerate getting more of those vehicles using and decarbonising on the way. So, you know, there's a bit of an idea or a vision of what might be possible. So anyway, that's the scene. So what is Ulenco doing to try and help use that? Because I basically, we want to make sure hydrogen vehicles are available to customers to use, because we believe that in your sector, these are by far the best version for you to have normal operations, do your normal business. we've heard from Barry, we can make a fuel competitively. We can give you a vehicle that mirrors mostly what you're used to doing with the diesel vehicle, and that you won't have to radically change everything that you're doing about your operation. So actually, that's what we're all trying to do, give you a vehicle that helps make that transition happen quicker. In our portfolio at the moment, we have a technology that I'm going to talk to you a bit more about that enables you to actually even do that even easier, where you can have the existing diesel vehicle, so your existing decision making on Euro 6 purchased vehicles or new or existing can significantly reduce their carbon emission and use some of Barry's hydrogen when he makes it available. And for every kilogram of hydrogen that you will use, you will be reducing your CO2 because it's green hydrogen in the process. And that's our hydrogen dual fuel technology. And what that ultimately means is taking an existing vehicle, we add high pressure hydrogen tanks similar to that would be on a fuel cell vehicle. We add gas injectors into the engine to enable us to put gas directly into the combustion chamber, and modify and provide some kind of diagnostic kits and wiring, etc. And that's what we would change. If there's no hydrogen available, the vehicle will still operate as diesel, which is really important because it says, as long as you use that bit of hydrogen, that's the proportion of CO2 that you will save, but actually you'll still be able to do the operation. And ultimately, you are able to carry on doing what you normally do in your operation, coping with the fact that we're building infrastructure to support that, and that we don't have it today, but we will have it sometime in the future, and it's growing. We do other technologies. We do have available commercially today a fuel cell based technology that could provide range extension to electric vehicles, but the limit on the availability of electric vehicles is the limit on what we could do with the fuel cell technology in that basis. And longer term, we're also doing work on 100% zero emission versions, because the dual fuel technology always has the proportion of diesel in the mix, so it's not zero emission, but it does significantly reduce the emissions. But we're doing R&D on 100% hydrogen combustion and in future fuel cell technology integration as well. So given all of that, why would somebody need to change, and why do they need to change now? And as your own research has shown, Colin, the flip side of some of what is the barriers are also some of the reasons why you really need to get on and do this now. Most importantly, actually, if I buy a diesel vehicle today, I need to make an assumption about what its value is going to be at the end of the life. Now, some people, 3 to 5 years, okay, they could probably accept that it's still going to be worth the same. But if you're going to own that vehicle for any longer than that, I wouldn't be the betting man that says that my current assumptions on that asset value is the same as what it was and has historically been, because there's all sorts of alternatives that will come. What's the resale value of that vehicle? I don't know. You can't make the same assumptions. The world of the future shouldn't be made on assuming what we've historically had. The reality is, and your customers, Colin, will, your members' customers will be looking for lower carbon solutions. Another message about that accelerated target is the fact that large corporates and our customers and the people we're dealing with are not waiting for the government target, but are actually setting targets that are far further in front of what the political targets are being created. And that's a really good thing. That says that we're embracing it. But the reality is, if we can offer a solution that's giving lower carbon than the guy next door to me, then there's a competitive advantage to doing that. And the reality is, based on some work that we've done with a number of our customers, that if we could do a fleet-wide conversion, I don't know, 100 urban trucks, your rigids, 100 rigids, Colin, in your members' portfolio, converted to dual fuel using Barry's green hydrogen, would save 2.6 or 2.6 million tons, is that? I don't know the calculation, but a lot of CO2 in the here and now based on a reduction. And the good thing is also, given the duty cycle of an urban truck, if we're putting dual fuel in, we also provide some air quality benefit as well. So we're assuming that you're fitting the technology to a modern Euro 6 diesel vehicle, because we want to make sure that the air quality emissions are good too, but we can have the CO2 saving on top of that. And that just puts into context, and this is where we are today, not necessarily where we be the future. But if we can do fleet-wide conversion now, using conventional technology that we have available to us, that also helps build the infrastructure, that helps us get to the point where the fuel cell vehicles are competitive, or the 100% hydrogen vehicles will be competitive, we're also doing a really good thing as well. We will save many hundreds of tons of CO2 by converting a vehicle today to run on hydrogen dual fuel. And that money is spent wisely and provides a better emphasis for the moment, based on the fact that the alternatives, and actually that's true for electric too, are all more expensive. So we will be spending a little bit more money. We are adding some cost onto the vehicle, but we're getting all of that saving at the same time. And that's the message that lots of customers across the UK have been trialling, no less and to no distraction the customers in Scotland, particularly around Aberdeen, where they've had hydrogen infrastructure for a long time, and they complement their bus portfolio with HGV fleets so that they can get the volume that Barry is needing to be located in one place to make it all make sense. But all of these customers have trialed. And you know, what I will draw the attention to, particularly in the bottom right hand corner of this picture, which are all real vehicles, a number of those deployed in Scotland as it is the Gritter fleet for Glasgow is an example of a process where we could take an existing vehicle, so half the 20 vehicles that we converted were existing in the fleet and half were new vehicles that Glasgow City Council was waiting for. And the minute that they have hydrogen available to do it, they will display, and then every kilogram of litre of diesel that they remove, they will reducing CO2 emissions from the green hydrogen that will be supplied. And just to talk about some opportunity on the Arctic, and I know that the Arctic in this particular instance is less important for your members, Colin, because you know the greater proportion are in that rigid, but there are solutions where we can also reduce CO2 emissions using green hydrogen on Arctics. Those will use 10 kilos a day on a 200-mile type round trip journey. And again, for every kilogram of hydrogen that they're using, they're displacing diesel and not emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. And there's a particular point there that's important about the alternative to an extent at the moment is to use natural gas or with a biogas certificate, but that biogas is still emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. From a total energy basis, it's clearly better than allowing that methane to come off in the farm and go to the atmosphere anyway and not to burn it and use it, but it's still actually emitting CO2. Whereas if you're using hydrogen in the tailpipe of these vehicles, they are not emitting CO2 according to the proportion of hydrogen that they're using. Just to show when and if your members, Colin, are interested, we can share real world data that shows what's possible with the range of types of vehicles that we can do from vans right through to Arctics. And the fact that as a company, we're here and able to provide all the standard maintenance and services that are needed for the conventional vehicle. As it happens, the hydrogen system doesn't require any extra maintenance, but we can also help, you know, make sure that the safety and all the other things are taken into account with practical experience. Similarly, I mean, Barry quite rightly talks about us collaborating together, but you know, every single hydrogen station in the UK has had some of our vehicles working out of it. So we have quite a lot of experience of what we need from a filling station, what we need from a hydrogen supply, what you need to do in a depot to make sure that you have a safe and can meet with the safety requirements, and we can help customers think through that process directly. Basically, in summary, our focus and plan is to work with companies like Barry who are keen to create the demand, crack that chicken and egg part, provide a solution that will enable locations using between 300 and 500 kilos a day. In our case, that would be, you know, as I said, on an Arctic, it would be 30 Arctics based around a location, would provide a base load of that. A refuse truck probably only uses 5 kilos a day. Your rigids delivering more locally would probably be similar to that, Colin. You're delivering sort of, you know, using anywhere between sort of 5 and 10 kilos a day, depending on the mileage. So that sets the context for the kind of number of vehicles you'll want around a location to make a sensible, usable business model. You know, that's really it. I think the picture on the left-hand side is a great example of how we need to move so that we get clusters of demand using the whole range of vehicles, whether that's fuel cell, hydrogen, dual fuel, in locations that suit so that people can have solutions. And on the right-hand side is an example of actually just a reminder, we have got opportunity for some of the members to trial an Arctic if that would suit. There's some limitations on that, but it's a sort of availability of a free trial of an Arctic that needs to be located and based around an existing hydrogen station. So we can happily talk about that on another occasion.
And fantastic, thank you very much. Certainly interested. I'm sure there'll be the members here today might like to talk to you about that opportunity. I said that we weren't going to take any questions just now. We'll go straight into Fiona and Ben, and I think we'll still do that actually, and then we can come back and compare, you know, full hydrogen fuel with the dual fuel solution that's available, and start and compare and contrast, and members can weigh one off against another. So Fiona, if you would like to take over, that would be great.
Great, thank you very much, Colin. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the Hydrogen Accelerator and some of the projects that have been in deployment up to date, and the future for the hydrogen technologies in Scotland. So Hydrogen Accelerator was a commitment by the Scottish Government in their 2019 programme for government. The Scottish Government in particular really sees the role that hydrogen can play in the Scottish economy, and also to position Scotland as a global leader and one of the early adopters of the technologies. Also the transitioning from a very fossil fueled economy to still try and retain those very vital jobs in the oil and gas industry that are used to high pressure gas and hydrogen, that we can still retain that skills base here in Scotland and start to really drive forward innovation and supply chain developments, creating those high value jobs. So where we're positioned now is really quite cross-cutting. It is working very much with the public sector and the private sector to really support that transition and drive forward innovation within this sector. We're funded through Transport Scotland, so we are very focused in the transport sector. However, we do cut across all different sectors to actually provide that collaboration and that research and that innovation to drive forward the technology. We are based at the University of St Andrews, which again, under the Professor John Irvine, who's world leading in fuel cells and hydrogen and battery technologies. And we're in partnership with the University of Strathclyde, very much around that engineering expertise as well. At the moment, we're a very small team. Jerry Agnew is our director, who's 23 years in Rolls-Royce, so very much again bringing that expertise into the team to really support us to make that transition. 2045 is the target for Scotland, and we have some way to go. Again, you know, we're phasing out for public sector fleets in 2025. So my role as a delivery manager is to really try and support the public sector to work in a collaborative way, really scaling up the projects in terms of actually the deployment of the fleets and also the economics, looking at how we can bring together those economic models going forward that really supports the public sector to actually drive forward their transition. Again, with the refueling infrastructure, we've done a lot of novel projects in the past, which has served us really well, and we've got lessons learned from those, but now it really is that scaling up opportunity. There's one thing about the hydrogen sector, it's all about collaboration. It's a snapshot of a few of the projects. So my background, I've been in the sector for 11 years. I'm from Aberdeen City Council originally, and then I moved to Scottish Cities Alliance, and I led on a programme, which is a European programme, and that was about kickstarting the hydrogen economy across the 7 cities. And this was about commercialisation of hydrogen fuel cell buses and also the hydrogen refuelling infrastructure. So 2 cities went forward at the time, and that was Dundee and Aberdeen. So Aberdeen has deployed 15 double-deck buses, and we're putting in another 10, and Dundee will be deploying 12 buses in the next year or so. The actual refueling infrastructure will be actually placed at Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, which was Michelin tyre factory, which many of you will know that actually was decommissioned about 1.5 years ago. It's now positioned as the sector, the centre for sustainable mobility for Scotland. Again, trying to retain those jobs, bring about that innovation. So us in St Andrews work very, very closely with MSIP about bringing together a skills academy there as well, and really bringing all that manufacturing together. I'll let Ben speak in a minute about all those green jobs that we are trying to set up at this particular facility. Part of that facility is about having a powertrain test centre set up there for all the innovative technologies of the future. So it's off-road testing for powertrains. So we were awarded 4 million from the Scottish Government to actually set that facility up. So working with Strathclyde as a partner and MSIP in bringing that particular programme together, which will see that actually come into fruition in the first quarter of 2023. This is a snapshot view of the Michelin Scotland Innovation Park. As you can see, it's a huge, great site and provides an enormous potential. There are a couple of turbines on that site that could generate green electricity for us with the hydrogen refueling infrastructure. And that Volta building is where we'll be having our powertrain test facilities deployed. And as you can see, Arcola Energy have set up their manufacturing plant just in that corner as well. So there's quite a nice cluster of other companies coming in there, all around their innovations, whether it's fuel cells, hydrogen, and battery technologies. I continue to work with all the 7 cities, and I've been supporting Glasgow with their fleet strategy and decarbonisation over the next 10 years, which they want to reduce to 5 years. So very much around looking at their heavy fleet vehicles, which they've put the stake in the ground that they want them all to be fuel cell electric. So raising some funding through Transport Scotland for a prototype refuse collection vehicle that Arcola Energy, in partnership with Farrad Hill End, actually have produced, which they'll have demonstrated at COP, and that's led on to another fleet. But I'll let Ben talk more about that. And again, as Amanda said, around the dual fuel gritters as well. So really effective way of making that step change into heavy fleet vehicles and really driving forward the decarbonisation of Glasgow, which is a very, very big fleet, captive fleet, to actually decarbonise. So completely changing the way they actually use their vehicles. They're double shifting now, they're moving into the fuel cell department. So the potential for having hydrogen refueling infrastructure, the tender process is out at the moment. This is the Palmer's site, which is the big GREC energy for waste plant in Glasgow. And that surrounds a number of organisations such as Transport Scotland Roads, First Bus is just down the road, and also Alstom. So again, about all this clustering is really looking where you position that hydrogen refueling infrastructure is to make sure that we can maximise the opportunities for what public and private sector organisations are located in that region to really maximise the scale and get that economics to really stack up. What's going on here? Okay, when Barry was talking about Whiteley, through the work that's going on in Glasgow City Council, that really supports then to really start to scale up the opportunity for green hydrogen. You'll see in a minute when I start talking about the train project, you see we'd need thousands of tons of hydrogen a year, that it really starts to help to really get these wind farms deployed and actively producing that green hydrogen, which in Scotland we have an abundance of water and wind, and we have the right ingredients to really produce green hydrogen. And this map is on the fuel cell electric train decarbonisation for ScotRail and Transport Scotland Rail. And you'll see on the left-hand side, it's green all the way up to the Highlands, and again the yellow part on the east side from Aberdeen into Inverness. So, and they're then further down on the west side from Ayrshire down. These areas are not going to be electrification taking place there. So there's a massive opportunity again for fuel cell electric trains to be deployed, and again scaling up the opportunity for large scale production of green hydrogen. So really looking right across the sector coupling of different transport modes, we can come together to really start that decarbonisation programme. So the St Andrews, the Hydrogen Accelerator, we led on this project. We procured this train. It was a redundant train for ScotRail, and Arcola Energy in partnership with Arup and Arc and Aegis, and thanks to Angel as well, have come through to provide some funding for temporary fuel infrastructure. They're converting this class 314 train, which will be demonstrated at COP26 this year. And that's Minister Day there, who's been to the site and is really impressed with the train, and very excited about the opportunity for decarbonisation of the train sector as well in Scotland. And again, I'm just going to finish here on the SHIFT programme. The Hydrogen Accelerator is really, really excited about supporting this programme and looking right across the different sectors such as timber, food and drink and utilities to really start to support, again, another sector to try and make that transition into the hydrogen and fuel cell technology sector. And now I'll hand over to Ben to continue on about the technologies. Thank you.
Hopefully I just managed to successfully wrestle control of the presentation.
I think you got it.
Can I move? See if I can. Yes, I can move the presentation. Afternoon, folks. So yeah, I'm Ben Todd, I'm the CEO of Arcola Energy. So I'm going to talk to you about fuel cells and hydrogen vehicles, give you a little bit of technology kind of oversight in general of hydrogen fuel cell options, and then talk a bit about the SHIFT project. There's some quite dense slides at the end on SHIFT that really are intended for sharing later. So yeah, the deck will be available, so you can all read about how you can engage in SHIFT. So start off then. Oh, I get the deck to move. Yeah, okay. So yeah, Arcola Energy. So we're a leading UK specialist in hydrogen and fuel cell integration, focused really on zero emission heavy duty vehicles. So we've built fuel cells, integrated fuel cells in everything from kind of 1 watt toys up to designs for multi-megawatt power generation systems. But really the focus at the moment is all about heavy vehicles. So it's not really the vehicles on I assume it's the left, if it is on your screen, but it's not the small passenger vehicles. Leave that to the likes of Toyota and Hyundai and all the other kind of mainstream vehicle OEMs that are kind of having dallied in hydrogen 10, 15 years ago are sort of coming back in again. We focus on the heavy stuff. There's a lot of talk about HGVs in the US, obviously kind of class 8. There's a lot of focus on that. The SHIFT project that we're kind of talking about here is the headline is the HGV, sorry, of the Arctic variety. But in fact, the rigid is the area that we see as being a quicker to market. So it's really, I'm very pleased to hear that a lot of the wholesale association members, the rigid is the majority of your fleet. So that's our area of interest. And really, essentially, if it's heavy, if it's got a back to base or a well-defined duty cycle, and there's a driver for zero emissions, then we're interested in putting a fuel cell in it. So we've worked across these kind of 4 areas. So off-road machines, so machines of kind of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 and beyond, up to hundreds of tons. So looking at, we've built a 20-ton machine, done studies for 200-300-ton machines. For trains, we're doing the class 314 project that Fiona mentioned for Transport Scotland, Scottish Enterprise. We've done designs for trains in various other countries, some of which now have kind of come to fruition. Bus was the kind of first market, really. We did our first hydrogen fuel cell double deck bus back in 2014, and we'll be bringing the buses to market for the Dundee project. And trucks, really, Glasgow is our first truck, the Glasgow bin lorry project. But once you've done a 26-ton bin lorry, it's obviously quite straightforward then to extend into any number of rigid vehicle configurations and platform. And obviously Arctic then follows through. So if I just take an example of why would people bother doing a double deck bus? So going right back to before really electric was everywhere, was just getting people to understand the joy of electric drive. Some of your drivers may not be aware, but in general, once people have driven electric, they don't really want to go back to diesel. It's quiet, it's smooth, it's responsive. So there is a kind of driver benefit for going towards electric. We have a much better fuel efficiency. So wherever you get your hydrogen from, if you design your vehicle properly, you can get a 40% efficiency gain over diesel. It's route dependent, but that's down to being able to do regenerative braking. So when you put the brakes on, you can recover the energy. And it's down to just a more effective electric platform. Refueling is still fast. So the challenges that we have with battery electric vehicles, working out that charging logistics, you don't have with hydrogen. It's a gaseous fuel typically. There's a few extremes of liquid hydrogen, but think of it as a compressed gas. So it's like filling a vehicle with auto gas or CNG. So you can fill in 5 to 10 minutes. The efficiency, this is for buses. So you'll hear a lot of talk about kilograms of hydrogen per 100 kilometers. That's the kind of chosen metric. I think what you really need to think of is that the price we're looking at to have kind of diesel parity is £5 or £6 per kilogram hydrogen. And that will, in many applications, give you kind of roughly cost parity. When we talk about trying to get hydrogen costs down to £1, £2, £3 a kilogram, that's where you really do get your full total cost of ownership. You can take in the capital cost, the maintenance cost, and the fuel cost, and you can wipe the floor with diesel. So that efficiency is obviously really important, as is well known in any vehicle. The range then is obviously down to how many tanks you can fit. We typically look at all of the vehicles that we do. We say, how can we not reduce the payload? So on a bus, don't take out any passenger space. So what's the maximum range you can get without impacting payload? That'll be our first starting point. If you then say, well, actually, I'm willing to, well, I'd rather not, but I will tolerate some loss of payload, you can just keep adding more hydrogen and your range can go up as high as you like. You don't get the challenge you have with battery. If you do battery only, then your challenge is you can't really go up as much as you like because you end up carrying so many batteries around. It's ever reducing benefit. You don't really get that with hydrogen. You've got a fixed amount of weight with the battery. There is a battery I'll show in a moment with the battery in the fuel cell system, but adding more hydrogen doesn't really add much more weight. Yeah, so you can do extremes of range if you need to. And there's some other benefits versus battery only around thermal integration. So the byproduct of a fuel cell is water, which comes out of steam from the tailpipe, and heat. So clearly on colder days, we can capture that heat. So I'm sure you'll be well aware that with battery electric vehicles, which by the way, I think are brilliant, and everybody should use them where they make sense. But one of the challenges is in the winter, the range goes down because you turn the heating on. You get a similar factor in hot countries if you put the air conditioning on. So that the thermal demand, whether heating or cooling, is often in excess of the traction power demand. So that's certainly true of slow moving vehicles, probably not true of an HGV hammering down a motorway, but for urban delivery, you may well find that heating cooling load really does become quite significant. So the next vehicle then to move on to is a refuse collection vehicle. So it's a 26-ton truck. Essentially, obviously, this one's got a compactor and a lift on the back, but essentially could be any truck. So the approach with a fuel cell vehicle, so it is electric, so you still get that 100% zero emissions. So you fit your low emission zones, clean air zones, and so on. But you have all that benefit we talked about on the bus. So this is a production ready solution. For the refuse collection vehicle, this one's been considered, has been optimized around a relatively short range because it's about picking up thousands of Glaswegian bin lorries. And it's more about, can you do the full day? Can you pick up X thousand Glaswegian bins, not bin lorries, pick up bins rather than lorries, pick up X thousand Glaswegian bins and do the day and still refill and have the full payload. So again, there's many configurations of refuse collection vehicles that pop up on the internet. Most of them don't have the full payload. And in fact, with a derogation you can get, because it's an electric zero emission vehicle, you can actually take it up to 11 tons. So you get more payload than you would on an existing diesel. Also of importance for the refuse collection vehicle, I guess for extra urban deliveries, is that you can get up to full speed and you don't have that challenge where the speed capacity runs down. So you take an electric vehicle onto the motorway and you start to get really anxious because you're slowing down and you're not sure when you're going to fall off that cliff of battery availability. Low noise and waste heat recycling for the cab are the other benefits. So if we say that, let's take those as two existing vehicle classes. Let's just drill down a little bit into some tech. So really quick summary then of the benefits. So really why fuel cells are interesting is these two things. It's that it is true zero emission. It's the same performance as an electric vehicle because it is an electric vehicle. So people will often talk about, oh, a battery's good or hydrogen's good. The answer is they're both good. And there's very few hydrogen vehicles that don't have a battery in. The battery is about 1/10 of the size of a conventional battery-only vehicle, and it's a far safer chemistry than you would usually use. So the risk of a battery fire on a hydrogen vehicle is very, very much lower because we typically use a lithium titanate, so it's the safest of the lithium chemistries available. But it is fundamentally an electric vehicle, and the reason that fuel cell vehicles are coming to the fore or are becoming more practical and more cost-effective is because of all the great work that's been done on battery electric vehicles. But yeah, like battery, so there's no NOx, no emissions, no particulates, no CO2, no hydrocarbons, no smell, and essentially no noise, limited noise. Obviously you've got tire noise and you've got various horns and blowers. And on the other side of it, the bit that you'd normally compromise on a battery vehicle is, of course, that full operability. Some of the stuff that Barry talked about of, do you fill at the depot? Do you fill from centralized stations? Those considerations are essentially the same. Now, hydrogen filling station in a depot is a bigger commitment than a diesel tank. But as the technology evolves, as the regulations get better understood, it does become quite viable to put a hydrogen filling station in a depot if you've got a good fleet there, and it can become quite cost effective and practical. So a little bit then, I think Amanda touched on some of this as well, just sort of clarity really on the different types of hydrogen fueled vehicles. I think it's probably useful. So we said number one is a kind of what I would call a kind of pure fuel cell vehicle. When I say pure, it is still a hybrid, it's still got battery in, but the dominant source of energy is the fuel cell and the dominant source of power. So when you're driving, you're basically running on the fuel cell. The battery is just buffering and giving a bit of support. The battery is almost acting like a flywheel. So it's driven by electric. You get most of the power for the electric motor from the fuel cell. The battery, one of the things the battery is really important for is that regen. Yeah. So whether you're doing a takeoff on a hill, the battery will kick in, but equally when you slam the anchors on, the battery will kick in and soak up that energy. With a full fuel cell vehicle, there's no need to plug in. You never need to plug in. And we think that's probably best suited to heavy duty and long haul. A range extended battery electric vehicle is in a sense very similar to the fuel cell vehicle, but the sizing has been flipped. So instead of having a large fuel cell and a small battery, on a range extender, you have a large battery and a small fuel cell. So we've been putting, there's a Renault Kangoo vehicle that was developed a few years ago. So it's the Renault Kangoo EV, it's a tiny little van with a small fuel cell added as a range extender. So it takes away some of that range anxiety with the battery, consumes a bit of hydrogen, so you get some benefits. We tend not to do this because what you end up with is a kind of oversized battery. It's not typically the right chemistry to get the full benefit of having the fuel cell. So it's not designed for hybridization. And you still need to plug it in. So you get this funny, you don't really get the best of any of the worlds, but there will be applications where it will make sense. If we flip across then into internal combustion, so you're still putting hydrogen in. So you fill the vehicle with all of these vehicles, you fill with hydrogen. the extension of the range extender, which you fill with hydrogen and electric. So you can do pure hydrogen combustion. So this is effectively an engine, a gas engine that will burn hydrogen. These were developed in the past. BMW was one of the kind of big players in this, going back a good number of years. So it's effectively, it's an internal combustion engine designed to run on hydrogen. There's been a lot of noise if you follow it at all. A lot of the big gas engine manufacturers, these would be gas engines often for power generation, for ships, so MAN, the big diesel engine makers, are looking at doing a pure hydrogen ICE. JCB have just made a big fuss about it recently as well. So there's a couple examples there. There's some challenges around tuning ICEs to run on hydrogen. Managing NOx is always complex. But I would expect, given the way things are going, you're going to see more and more of this. Some of it will be around burning ammonia as well. So you take a very mature supply chain product family and you effectively switch the fuel. The dual fuel then that Amanda talked about. So this is a dual fuel ICE. As Amanda said, it will run on a mixture of hydrogen and diesel. So if you could run on pure hydrogen, you get zero CO2 and emissions. When you run on that mix, as Amanda said, you benefit from the kilograms of hydrogen, but obviously you've still got the diesel. So I'll probably have interest of speed. I won't go too quickly on this, but just sorry, I won't spend too much time on it. But really, just this understanding that the fuel cell is an electrochemical device. So just like a battery is an electrochemical device, in a battery you have all the chemistry inside the battery, and you effectively just shift the state of that chemistry to make electricity. In a fuel cell, it's exactly the same as the battery, except that all of the stuff isn't stored inside. You've got hydrogen in an external tank, and you've got oxygen in the air. Now, so it's fundamentally different from a combustion engine. Nothing goes bang, nothing goes pop. There's no vibration. There's none of that noise. It's straight, just like a battery would work. So what goes into a fuel cell electric powertrain? And this may be useful just as people, as you start to have those conversations with potential suppliers and the like, to understand what people are talking about. So if we start from the bottom in blue, like any electric vehicle, you've got electric motors, and typically those motors are going to be AC machines with inverters. So that's come straight off the electric vehicle. You know, the Toyota Prius has done more for the progression of fuel cell vehicles than a lot of other things. Prius was a petrol hybrid, but all of that development of the motors, the inverters. We then have a whole load of high voltage power distribution. So again, like an electric vehicle, a battery electric vehicle, moving that high voltage around so you can drive air compressors, air conditioning, the various ancillary systems all have to be electrified. Again, loads of work's been done on that. We're getting to the point of having volume manufacture of really reliable elements. This is the stuff that used to cause trouble on hydrogen vehicles. It'd be these small ancillaries that will break because they're made in small volume. If we jump to the right, then you've got the battery. So battery electric vehicle, you've just got a big battery. And all of this stuff stays the same. You've obviously then got your various low voltage systems. And if you ignored the hydrogen tank fuel cell and that fuel cell DC-DC, that's a battery electric vehicle. So for the fuel cell then, we downsize the battery. So very substantial, probably 90% downsizing a battery. And we replace the battery with a fuel cell and with hydrogen storage. So there's the elements in your vehicle. But I think it's really important for people to have that sense of this is an electric vehicle that happens to store a load of its energy in hydrogen rather than a really big battery. Sorry, there you go. I think it might jump to there. No, that's it. So what's that look like? So here's what we call it, the A-Drive. So I call it A-Drive platform. This is what we spent the last 12 years developing. It's a platform approach, which involves all the things you would expect. So the fuel cell engine, we work very closely with Ballard Power Systems, been around for 40 years, probably the world leader in fuel cell engines. We then work with a high power battery, as I touched on. So this is not the same battery chemistry you see in battery only vehicles. This is a high power, it's almost like a supercapacitor, and it's a really safe, resilient chemistry. We expect to get 14 years life out of the battery. Those of you that have spoken to people about the early hybrids, where the batteries died after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and people were stuck with vehicles with dead battery packs. Basically, people put the wrong chemistry in and misled the market. So the batteries we use, we really do expect to do the 14 years. On the right hand side, then is obviously the electric motor. as we talked about. So all of that conventional electrification kit and the hydrogen tanks. In this case, this is taken from the Glaswegian bin lorry, tanks on the roof. You can also, of course, put them behind the cab, and you can undersling them. And that really comes down to the packaging constraints, what safety constraints you've got. If you undersling the tanks, obviously you've got to be really careful about cornering and impact from below. You put them on the roof, obviously you're thinking about height and center of gravity. You put them behind the cab, you're thinking about how much you push the load backwards and what that does to dynamics. So there's quite a lot of work goes into thinking about where you want to put your tanks. So I think we'll probably cover this quite quickly. Maybe this is more for summary for you to read later. So it's about zero emission. We really do focus on the heavier vehicle. Very crudely, I think if you can do it with petrol, you might think about looking at battery. If you have to run on diesel, you really should be thinking about fuel cell and hydrogen. Yeah, it's a crude mix, a crude cutoff, but it's not a million miles away. And what's really useful about it is it gets away from this people saying it's a VHS Betamax argument. It's not. It's a petrol diesel argument, and so it's not really an argument. It's just choose horses for courses. Your battery versus hydrogen. Real focus on heavy duty. In terms of that chicken and egg challenge, if we can do back to base fleets, which are heavy vehicles, that means you've got a heavy demand of hydrogen. It's well understood. We don't need lots of filling stations everywhere because the fleet, we always know where the fleet is. That's where you can make a business case and you can drive much more quickly. It's why we're interested in talking to you guys. Benefit of hydrogen is again that high payload. Yeah, at some point it's just diminishing returns as you add more and more batteries. The other area, and I sort of touched on this with the air conditioning, is we saw a lot. We're doing some work in Asia, and a lot of companies saying, "Oh, buy this battery electric vehicle; it'd be brilliant." And then they'd run it, and they'd be like, "Well, it's rubbish." Well, why is it rubbish? Because you've got a massive air conditioning load. So this auxiliary energy use, so refrigeration, or if you've got a PTO for some other application, this is again where the benefit of hydrogen really kicks in, because you can store that extra energy to do traction and auxiliary ancillary, and the flexible use, that quick refuel. So the Shift project then, super fast now. So it's a Department for Transport project. There's 20 million investment, and they basically want to do fleet trials. So what we've got at the moment, we're in the feasibility phase. So there's a whole load of money being put out to investigate electric road systems. I'm sure you'll have strong views on those. So catenary wires down the motorway. Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, of which Shift is one of the funded projects, and a load of work on supply chain development. So we're the Shift project that we specifically want to talk to you about here. And it's about ambitious feasibility studies. So this is an opportunity to really quite seriously look. This is a big challenge, as has been talked about already. You can't piss about at the edges. We need to think about what would it take to shift a significant proportion of the fleet, and fast. So the consortium members, you can see there, we've got a great consortium together. I'll call it Energy doing the fuel cell piece. We're bringing in the likes of Scottish Power, so we managed the chicken and egg. The likes of Arup, oops, slides are jumping around there. The likes of Arup, who can do that kind of big energy system view, how's it all joined together? And obviously, folks like we're speaking to today, who are the end user? What do you guys actually want? What are the problem points? Where does it make sense? So effectively, there it is. Off we go. There's a project running now. Lee and Fiona on the call are both gathering information from you. So we'd like you to reach out, speak to us. Have you got an interest going forward? 44 ton is the headline, but it is really, rigids really is a much quicker thing to move on. So we're happy to talk about that as well. And in return for being part of the study, if you give us a load of duty cycle requirements, we'll model them up and we'll come back and we'll tell you, well, this is what we think might work. And our interest as a company is seeing good stuff happen. So if you give us a duty cycle, we go, do you know what, batteries work brilliantly, then we'll tell you. So we'll do some proper analysis and we'll share the results back to you. So there you go. That was hopefully useful. Happy to take any questions.
And thanks for that. Very interesting. You filled us in on a lot of the detail. I'm sure everyone was lacking. If I can ask the other panelists maybe to come back in, and we will certainly take questions. I realise we are running out of time, so please get your questions into the panel here. Just if you can maybe stop sharing the screen, Ben, that would be appreciated. So in terms of the Shift project, we are excited to be working with yourselves on that. Maybe we didn't go into the detail we'd hoped to go into, but certainly would like to hear from members that want to get involved. It will probably include more analysis of your fleets, etc. We already have a lot of that from our analysis, but we would like to get you or have you get in touch with us if you are running 44 tons or even 17 and 26 tonner rigids, because they are going to be involved in the project as well. And Lee, I think, is probably going to be one of our main contacts within Arcola and collating that information. Just looking at the questions, there is one question, good one, information on cost differences between the technologies. I think that was more in reference to the 4 different types of solutions available. I don't know, Amanda, if you want to come in on that first from your point of view.
Obviously, in our case, the hydrogen tank part of the system is the similar sort of components that you would have in a fuel cell system, but that's effectively what we're putting onto the vehicle. So I can be honest that if you do a one-off of a refuse truck, it will cost about £45,000 to fit onto a vehicle as a one-off. And that gives you up to 40% CO2 saving. For our fuel cell and 100% hydrogen combustion technology, certainly the 100% hydrogen combustion technology will be similar prices to conventional vehicles, a little bit more expensive because the hydrogen tanks are a bit more expensive, but at scale, the point of the combustion technology and the reason why some of the OEMs like MAN and stuff like that are doing that is I think they will be ways of offering cost-effective solutions. If you combine it with a bit of hybridization, you'd get similar sort of efficiency. So that would then be a little bit more expensive because you're having to add battery technology into the system.
Okay, and Ben, I don't know if you want to come in on the cost piece as well.
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, fuel cell is early market. So if you look at the kind of cost down that we're seeing on solar and wind, and the cost down that we're starting to see in battery, although we're hitting limits because with batteries, the more you need, the more stuff you have to put on. Fuel cells are way up on the cost curve. So at the minute, the fuel cell vehicle, you're not going to do a fuel cell vehicle without a subsidy. Simply not going to happen. But the cost down that we're seeing, the kind of learning rate, as they call it, is mirroring those other technologies. So it won't be that long before you should see cost parity. But it's, yeah, right now it's expensive. So if you want to put hydrogen fuel cell vehicles on the road, you need to be talking to Lee and Richard Kemp-Harper, our strategy director, about figuring out how, or indeed Fiona in the accelerator, about how to put a project together to bring in some subsidy for the vehicle cost. And again, it's what the Shift project is about. Set up a feasibility study, do a proper business case for it, and then we'll get the early vehicles on the road. And the key with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, if we could put a fleet of 50 vehicles on the road, that would be a really significant worldwide, globally significant fleet. We really are basically at the hand-built stage at the minute. So costs are just going to crash once we get to proper automated production.
No, absolutely, and that was the exciting part of getting involved in Shift. It is about putting that project together, getting some trials on the road, hopefully within our membership, and starting to help reduce that cost, because it is all very well here talking about the technology, and it's all great, genuinely, it's all great, but it does come back to that cost piece, and obviously that descending problem that we have in terms of what are the biggest prohibitors, and cost is one, and Amanda, even through the stuff that we're looking at with you, it is still that cost prohibitive element that prevents us even from doing the dual fuel, and that's where that engagement between all of us with Scottish Government can hopefully start and release some funds either for one-off projects or subsidies, which would be the ideal, is the same as they did to get electric vehicles on the road. They subsidise them to start with. That's what government need to do. And Fiona, I don't know if you're closer to government than probably any of us. Is that something you think Scottish Government might bring in their hydrogen strategy?
Very much so. Obviously, we're funded by Transport Scotland, and they sit on our board, and I meet with them every week. And they're very conscious that they need to start to look at the subsidisation, that models that are required to really help other sectors, such as the hydrogen sector. So yeah, I do think there will be. And the action plan that will come out later on this year with the Scottish Government, again, I'm hoping there'll be some really good funding opportunities there as well. Be looking at that total cost of ownership and what subsidisation will be there for going forward. Yeah.
No, brilliant. And just following up, you know, it's a subsidy and involvement in the private sector, not the public sector, that's been favoured all the way through this. You know, so instead of the 15 buses, it could be 15 of our vehicles. I'm just looking, Sam, you've got a question. We've sort of partly answered it. If order today, how long would it take to arrive? The costing, well, it's prohibitive, but you know, what is the sort of turnaround that we are looking at? The technology is there. If somebody was wanting to put in the, you know, 40 to 100+ K investment, what's the turnaround time?
Well, in our case, if you place an order today, we have a short lead time related to ordering the tanks. The vehicle needs to be with us for a couple of weeks, and we could have it to you within 6 months.
And a fuel cell?
Fuel cell vehicle, you're probably looking at closer to 18 months at the moment. So that it'd be understand what your vehicle is, what the platform is, and then we develop the solution from there.
Okay. So the lead times are still quite long, and that's, I guess, where we need, you know, the more vehicles we can have, the shorter that lead time becomes as we become more automated. Because as you say, Ben, I think it is all, they're all hand built.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just conscious we are now slightly over time. I don't know if there's anyone else who would like to put in any other questions before I bring the webinar to an end. Clearly, you know, we're at the start of the journey here, as are the developers and infrastructure engineers. We'll be working closely with them and keeping our members updated. One of the things that we are looking to do within the association here, and so that you can work closer with the developers, is to look at setting up a sustainability strategy group that's looking at, you know, our fleets and our buildings and all the other sustainability policies and issues that we face, from waste to packaging, etc. So if you're interested in potentially be sitting on that group, certainly drop me a line. That also ties into the position that we're looking at bringing in a sustainability officer. That's still been mapped out, and we'll take on some of the role that Jess had been doing for us. Jess was with us for a part-time basis, pulling together the project. She has now left us and is down in London as we speak. So we are looking to bring in somebody with, I guess, more experience than what maybe Jess had. So no questions for fans. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone, our panelists, for giving us their insight. Thanks for our members joining us. As I said, this is the start of the journey. Please let us know who wants to be involved in trials and in the sustainability group. And I will now draw the webinar to an end. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.
Colin.
Cheers,
All the
guys.
best.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Paul. Cheers.